Metaxas, thank you very much indeed for joining in a conversation. You're a prolific writer of history, 3 great biographies and many other shorter stories. You run a current affairs program. You've very much got your finger on the culture wars here in the United States. So appreciate the chance to have a conversation.
Well, I appreciate being asked to be part of the conversation. I am sincerely honored and thrilled because I think this kind of thing, I do some of this, and I think it is extremely important to talk about the things that you want to talk about with me, and I really feel honored and thrilled and looking forward to it.
Henry Ford said history is bunk.
Yeah.
You hear a lot of people saying...
I think Henry Ford was not pro-history, but he did some good things with cars, as far as I know. But I learned that from the history books, so there you go, Henry.
But you believe passionately, you wouldn't have devoted so much of your life to bringing back to the table so many of those greats who have gone before us. Tell us why.
Well, first of all, it was not my intent to do that. I was almost tricked into writing a biography of Wilberforce. It's really funny. I was on CNN here in the States in 2005 talking about a book of Christian apologetics I'd written called Everything You Always Want to Know About God But Were Afraid to Ask. And in the book I just mention glancingly that Wilberforce, because he took the Bible so seriously, changed the world. And the impact of the Bible on certain individuals, it just changed everything. And the interviewer on the CNN program asked me, rather than asking me about angels or demons or anything else in the book about this apologetics about Christianity, homes in on this and asks me to talk about Wilberforce. So I find myself talking about Wilberforce. Next thing I know, I get an email from a publishing house saying, "Would you like to write a biography of Wilberforce? We're coming up on the bicentennial of the abolition of the slave trade, which was 1807. And there's a movie coming out called Amazing Grace. Would you like to write a biography to come out with the movie?" And I thought, I've never, ever thought or had an ambition, really, to write a biography. None. I always say that I'm far too self-centered to want to spend that much time focused on someone else. And yet, I prayed about it. It was one of these strange things that I thought, I think I would have fun writing about that period in history. There's certain periods that are more appealing, but 18th century England, I thought this could be fun. And so I just launched into it. And I thought, I'm not an academic, but I can tell the difference between something that's true and something that's not. I have no problem with that. And so I leapt into it. And it was in the course of writing about Wilberforce and doing the research that I discovered what's in the book, which sounds like a tautology. But what I'm saying is that I didn't know very, very much about the subject. I knew the basics, that this is the man who led the battle for the abolition of the slave trade in the British Empire. He'd succeeded in that. But then I discovered how much more there was, how much deeper it went, all of the other players involved, the role that Christian faith played in this whole group, the Clapham Circle, as I call them. And it's amazing because when you look at the facts through a Christian lens, or I should say that, I bring my own worldview to the table, and I thought, other books on Wilberforce have not done the Christian influence any measure of justice. There would be no Wilberforce, there would be none of this, there would be absolutely none of it without the dramatic faith. I mean, this was not surface faith, dramatic faith of people like William Wilberforce. And so it's not that I really meant to bring that out in the book, but it just came out naturally. I thought this is extremely obvious now that I'm looking at the facts. And what's also extremely obvious is that Great Britain was profoundly pagan. I mean, we think that because you are officially, that Great Britain's officially a Christian nation, that they behave in a Christian way. Well, Wilberforce put the lie to that. He said, no, no, no. If we're Christians, we must do this and this and this and this. So he sort of forced them to take their nominal Christianity a little bit more seriously. But none of that was known to me. And so, of course, having written that book, it kind of sucked me into conversations on history and then questions about whom I will tackle next, assuming that now I'm going to write historical biographies for the rest of my life or something like that. So it really wasn't something that I planned. But having gotten into it, yes, it now strikes me as extremely valuable. One of the most important things we can do is learn history. So with apologies to my fellow American Henry Ford, he was wrong.
He came, as he went through life, to love his own history. He spent a fortune recreating his home farm life and all sorts of things like that.
That's right, yeah.
So he must have seen some value in it
Yeah.
as he aged and matured. But interesting for you as an American, as the whole sort of slavery issue here, the horrors of the Civil War, so forth, to discover that in fact the British Empire, which was the superpower of the day, had been there well before the Civil War, had tackled this issue. And so far as I am aware, it was the only culture, the only peoples anywhere who'd actually got rid of, ended slavery. And it happened in two parts. There was the ending of the slave trade, which was brutal beyond all belief, then of slavery itself.
Well, the histories with regard to slavery of Great Britain and the United States are very, very different. I mean, for one thing, in Great Britain, one never saw slavery. It was invisible. It was something that supported the economy, but you didn't walk around and see slaves in the fields in England. No, all of the slavery went on across the Atlantic in the West Indies, and so it was an invisible thing. The ships would leave the three main ports. Wilberforce's port, Hull, was the only of the four English ports, big ports, that did not have much of a slave trade at all. And it's because of that, really, that he was politically allowed to stay. If he'd been battling, on his own turf, but he didn't have to deal with that. But from these other ports, you have ships going out, and no one sees them. They go down to West Africa, they pick up human cargo, they go across the Atlantic to the West Indies. All of the sugar plantations were owned by the English, including the Church of England.
Yes.
But who saw it? No one saw it. The brutality of the slave trade, the brutality of the slave of the plantations. There just was no evidence of it in British life. So it's a whole different thing. In this country, it was part, in America I should say, it was part of what one saw day by day in the South. In the North, of course, not so much. But it's dramatically different.
So there's a couple of things there I'd love to tease out. The first is the issue of Britain being, England being a pretty pagan society, a terrible society. The second is, if we could take these in order, is that the reason that I want to talk about this is that whole era when, Britain was the coloniser of my country, Australia, and it was undergoing massive change, social change, and economic change, very much for the better. But one of the things that people often say in the slave trade is, the Bible justifies slavery and Christians kept slaves and what have you. It's important to note that the moral impulse to tackle this came from those Christians. It hadn't come out of the Enlightenment era at all.
Well, I mean, this cannot be said often enough. Anytime anyone says the Bible supports slavery, that is absolutely untrue. 100% untrue. It is nonsense. But people repeat nonsense over and over and over until everyone acts as though it's true. It's absolute nonsense. There's all kinds of horrors described in the Bible, but one of the seminal moments in the Bible is the exodus of the Israelites from slavery. I mean, it's the most dramatic example of God leading people out of slavery, the most dramatic example, I should say, in the Bible of anything, and it's God leading people out of slavery. But there are all kinds of terrible things that are depicted in the Bible, but not because God approves of them or because God's people approve of them, but because they were a reality of the time. But as you said, the impulse to abolish slavery came almost exclusively from serious, devout Christians. The mere churchgoers. In other words, when people want to say, Christians had slaves and so on and so forth, yes, people who were mere churchgoers, who were not devout, were inclined to do all kinds of terrible things. The Church of England owned slave plantations, as we said, in the West Indies, but it was the evangelicals. So we have to make the distinction. Wilberforce was he was officially part of the Church of England, but he was an evangelical, effectively behind enemy lines. The establishment church, as is the case in many countries, is dead. And it's the reformers from within and without, like Wilberforce, who have this evangelical impulse, who talk about being born again, who talk about a relationship with Jesus. Those are the people that led the battle against the slave trade, against slavery, and those are the people who were often fighting people who claimed the mantle of Christianity, but were in fact just bureaucrats or ecclesiastical figures whose faith, I would say, since they're not alive anymore, I can say that their faith was effectively dead. They were just moving papers. They really didn't burn for justice and have empathy toward their fellow human beings. It was the evangelicals, of course, they were called the Methodists or the enthusiasts in 18th century England. In the American movie by Steven Spielberg, Amistad, it tells the story, it has to do with abolitionists and slaves, and it's around 1840, might be even earlier than that. But the earliest abolitionists in the United States of America were all Bible-carrying, Bible-thumping evangelicals. There's no question about it. And so if you want to see where abolition started, it was always evangelicals. It's absolutely undeniable. So when people say things like, Christians approved of slavery, people may have been technically Christians in that they weren't Muslims, they weren't atheists, they weren't Jewish, so they say they're Christians. Well, what Wilberforce and his ilk illustrated is that they're Christians and they're Christians. They're Christians who live out their faith, who see these things, these injustices, and abolish them, do what they can to abolish them, and work against these injustices. And then there are people who simply call themselves Christians and go to church. That has never been any different. I mean, you can even say the same thing about the ancient Israelites. There are the people of God, and then there are the people of God. And just because you are technically Jewish, just because technically you're part of the nation of Israel, doesn't make you Moses. There were people that bought into these ideas, that had a relationship with God, and then there were other people who were dragging their feet and even opposing things. So you have the Church of England, and then you have, I would say, establishment figures in the church in the United States who were strongly opposed to abolition. But the Bible thumpers, the serious Christians, whom we would call today evangelicals, they were the ones that pushed for abolition. Then eventually it caught on with others. But let's not kid ourselves. That's the provenance of abolition, period, end of sentence.
I've always been very interested in that period of history, and I have to say, I can't fault your logic. And part of the reason you can't is that you read, Wilberforce himself wrote a book.
Yeah.
In which he sought to set out the difference between what he understood to be real Christianity and what the common perception of it was.
Yeah.
And then you read some of what he actually said in the Parliament, and you read some of the letters and so forth that he sent to his sons. There's no doubt that he was a man who had, if you look at it on paper, everything to gain by maintaining his position of great privilege and of great wealth.
Yeah.
Seen as a potential future Prime Minister of Great Britain,
Oh, yeah.
turns his back on it all out of deep conviction, And of course, the first political movement started out of it. The whole idea, am I not a brother and a man? The Wedgwood...
the famous Wedgwood plaque, yeah.
Yeah, so it was very real to them.
Yeah.
Their motivation was very real. It was not... The thing that I think it's important to state here, this was not a movement that came out of the Enlightenment. Important as it is
Absolutely
for our
not.
modern freedoms and the way we view the world.
No, I mean, in fact, you could argue that anything good that came out of the Enlightenment really ultimately came out of a biblical worldview. You know, you can't pretend that the Enlightenment, you know, sprang from the head of Zeus. I mean, it has its own roots, and there's a biblical culture. You know, even valuing reason, the idea of valuing reason, or the idea of valuing human beings. It comes out of a biblical worldview. Now, you know, you don't have to like that, but these are facts.
That's a very significant thing you just said. It's as you know, you'd never seriously say in medical science that you would obscure or rub out or deny something that was critical in science, and yet people seem to feel they can do it in history if it doesn't suit the modern narrative.
Yeah. Well, this is a problem we have, and it's really since the '60s. You know, in the West, that we have adopted a kind of anti-Western, anti-Christian, and as an American, I would say anti-American worldview and narrative, that we focus on the shortcomings to the exclusion of the good things. And that has value to a point. In other words, it's important to see one's shortcomings. If you don't see the racism and the slavery and other things, the sexism, if you don't see that, that's bad. You need to see these things, but why? So that you can repent of them, not so that you can get stuck in a cycle of self-flagellation, self-hatred, which I think the West is kind of in this situation. I think, you know, Europe and all of the West has, I don't know who first said it, but we've lost cultural confidence. There was a time when we knew that the values that we had were not just good, but great, that we wanted to export them to the whole world because we knew that there were people in places like India and China who would dream to live with this kind of freedom. And so we carried that flag, as it were, around the world with pride and with faltering steps and with mistakes, but we carried that flag. We understood that there was a mission, that spreading freedom and these biblical values, the sanctity of the individual, all of those things come out of the Bible, and they became part of the Western culture that Great Britain and America, to an extent, were exporting. And then something happened, roughly, you could say in the '60s, although, you know, in England it may have happened after the First War, but somehow we lost cultural confidence, and we could only think of the things that we had done wrong. And that's really, you know, if you're watching a movie about a great man who suddenly becomes obsessed with his mistakes and ceases to do anything great because he's obsessed with his shortcomings, you know, it would be a tragedy, right? You'd say, oh, you've done so much good. He goes, no. He can only think of the bad things. And meanwhile, he's thinking of the bad things. He's not doing any more good things. That's kind of the story of the West in the last 50 or so years, is that we've gotten so hung up on our shortcomings that we forget that we abolished slavery. We ended slavery, this wicked thing that existed since the beginning of time. Since the beginning of humanity, there have been human beings oppressing other human beings. We outlawed it at great expense. I mean, Great Britain spent, what was it, 800,000 pounds sterling, I think it cost the government of the United Kingdom to abolish slavery. I mean,
they compensated the slave owners, not the slave.
Right, but it was a huge expense, because they felt it was the right thing to do. And similarly, in the United States, we waged a horrible war. We very easily could have said, okay, South, secede. Thank you very much. We'll have our own country. We fought a war to abolish
one of the most terrible
slavery.
Wars of all.
Horrible, horrible war. How many American men died? of course, not only for the cause of abolishing slavery, but principally that was it, died, gave their lives for something larger. You know, when you begin ignoring those kinds of sacrifices, you're in trouble. And I think that we have forgotten the great things that have been done. It's a terrible shame.
So, I mean, neither of us would argue that we should not learn from the mistakes we've made. We should not be honest when we've got it wrong. But it's incredibly important that we don't give up or that we airbrush out of our history things that are very important. Let's just go back. The reason that I think this is important for Australians to be aware of is that we were colonised by a country that was massively reforming, as I mentioned a moment ago, because it wasn't just slavery. In fact, the slavery thing went even further in a way. It changed the global mindset. It was so successful, the movement, that it completely switched the thinking of all decent people everywhere. Nobody's going to stand up today and say, oh, I think slavery is part of the natural order of things. No one's going to do that. We know horrendously it hasn't ended yet, but nobody's going to defend it. So we've changed the mindset.
And that to me is the ultimate legacy of Wilberforce. He was able to, murder the idea forever that slavery might be acceptable. He destroyed that idea forever. Working out the details is another story, but the idea, it's never returned. I mean, not in the West. Again, in those parts of the world, the globe, where Western values have not been exported, you really see a worldview that says it's okay to oppress people. You see this in parts of Africa now with Islam. Islam has no problem enslaving other human beings. None. They just feel that is the natural order of things. And it's almost funny that we could be moving into the 21st century and there are still parts of the world that are not sold on the idea that slavery is always evil. But where are those places? Those are the places that either are not seriously Christian, don't come out of Christianity and Christian history, or that are actively opposed to Christianity. They're in fact enslaving Christians. That's something that needs to be put on the table. These are facts. And
to go back though, again to that period, Wilberforce obviously led that campaign. He was supported by many others. Some of the very wealthiest people in England, by definition, in the world, the Thornton family, the researchers, they clubbed together, they used data, they ran political campaigns, but it was more than just slavery that they attacked. It was political representation, doing away with rotten boroughs, ultimately extending suffrage. The women's suffrage movement actually came out of evangelical Christianity.
Well, this is the thing, is that once the gospel is let out of the bag, so to speak, it touches everything, it affects everything. I've often preached this, that Jesus changes everything. Sometimes it takes time, but the fact of the matter is when Wilberforce was able to drag the gospel into the center of British life and onto the floor of Parliament, slowly but surely it touched everything. The thing that Wilberforce did, of which he was most proud, except for the abolition of the slave trade, was his work in bringing missionaries to India. Not many people know about this. There's a chapter in my book, Amazing Grace, where I deal with this. He thought that, I shouldn't say he thought, he knew that the entrenched business interests, now these were, British businessmen, in India didn't care a whit for the Indian people. They just thought, we're here, we'll let them do what they do, and we will do what we do, and we will make great profits. Wilberforce thought, no, we have a tremendous obligation to the people of India to bring them the light of truth, to bring them freedom, to bring them learning. Women were horribly oppressed in Indian society.
Burning of widows.
And I was going to say, the ultimate example of that is the burning of widows. It was called sati. Wilberforce would read the newspaper, in London, and he would seethe with rage to read of another woman who'd been burned alive.
Alive.
And so he said, we need to do something about this. In other words, we can't say, well, that's their culture, they can do as they like. I mean, today we have issues of female genital mutilation and the way women are treated in Islam, especially in radical Islam, and we sort of act as though, well, that's their thing and we have our thing, and you think, these are human beings. If you care about the treatment of women, you need to care about the treatment of those women. You need to crusade against it. Wilberforce fought a bitter battle to bring missionaries into India against the wishes of many in the British establishment, because he knew that when you brought missionaries, you would bring Christian values. Christian values would help the poor. Christian values would help the women. Christian values would help everyone. And they had an opportunity, and not just an opportunity, but an obligation to do it. And it's an amazing thing. If you're a woman afraid of being burnt to death, we can't even imagine the horror. Wouldn't you hope that these Englishmen who've come here, who claim to be Christians, would try to impose their Christian values so that you wouldn't have to be burnt to death? I mean, it's almost bitterly funny that who can doubt that that's what oppressed people would want, is that these Brits would impose their Christianity a little bit because we're suffering. And it was Wilberforce, it was the hot-headed evangelicals who did that. The establishment was really not very interested.
And interestingly, in the case of Australia, colonised in the midst of all of this ferment, all of this change, this view that the worth and dignity of the individual has to be upheld.
Yeah.
So the head of the Navy,
Middleton, yeah.
Charles Middleton, he makes certain that the First Fleet is done properly. And his objectives are very, very interesting. They were very widespread. He wanted to see convicts given the opportunity to rehabilitate. That was enlightened in its day. He believed...
Incredible.
It didn't always go well, but he believed that, at least let's not question his motivation in this, that the bringing of their civilization to the Pacific would be a good thing for the people who lived there.
Yeah.
Now, that's a sensitive thing to say now,
Yeah.
but his motivation was quite clear.
Yeah.
He had a high view
Yeah.
of the people in the colonies,
Yeah.
of the native people, the indigenous people. And of course, he believes in good order.
Yeah.
So he thinks, right, we're going to do this properly to reflect well on a God who believes in good order. So the First Fleet, by the standards of the day, was a remarkable success. That all the ships made it,
Yeah.
complete with a chaplain put there in the fleet by Wilberforce. Sailing orders instituted by Wilberforce, no slaves in the new colony.
That's amazing.
As I understand it. The early first governor made it plain that there would be no slaves. The convicts were to be properly looked after. They weighed more when they arrived than when they left England.
That's amazing.
Now the second and the third, the
Yeah.
British government, second and third fleet, British government decided, it was a bit pricey to do it properly. We'll put it out to tender. And a shipping company that had specialised in slave trading won the second and third contracts. They were miserable. The convicts died like flies. They arrived without provisions. It was a mess. The British government, for the fourth time around, went back to a Christian provider, and the fourth fleet, one person died. So we need to be careful. The left now wants to insist, it seems to me. We've got some interesting debates going on in Australia, and there have been quite a few prominent people from the left who have said, in the context of religious freedom, what we need is legislation to protect us from, or to give us freedom from religion. That's not new either. Lord Melbourne,
Right.
who was to become Prime Minister of Great Britain, couldn't stand what Wilberforce was doing.
Well, yeah, it's almost funny how ridiculous it sounds now, except for the fact that you have people reprising these ridiculous ideas and not realizing it. But yeah, Lord Melbourne was deeply offended that Wilberforce wanted to bring his Christian faith into public life. He thought he should keep it private. Keep it private.
We hear that today.
Of course we hear that today. And you realize that it's like saying, you have money or medicine. It's like, keep it private. Don't share it with anyone. It has tremendous value for everyone. Wilberforce actually cared about the African slaves. Now, Lord Melbourne didn't seem to care about them. That's just a fact of history. Wilberforce traded the good possibility of being prime minister because he cared more about the suffering of the slaves. And he knew that I have to do what God's called me to do. I can't worry about my credentials, whether I get to be prime minister or not. And so he gives his entire life over to bringing what he knows is right into the public sphere, into Parliament, so that people can see that if we call ourselves Christians, we must care for the poor. We must care for these Africans that are being mistreated. It's an amazing thing that this is what happens when you bring your faith into public life. It gives you the idea that, maybe we have a responsibility to care for the poor. Now today, everyone acts as though, well, of course we all know that. Where did you get that idea? Where did that idea in history come from? It comes from these Methodists, these evangelical Christians who saw people, rotting in the street and said, we've got to help these people, we've got to do this. Now, there's nothing new. In ancient Rome, before Constantine, you have Christians picking up babies in the streets that have been left to die. You have them caring for the sick, doing all these kinds of things because they have an inner conviction. That's what Christians must do. The idea that Christians should keep their faith private, it's crazy historically, because if we had done that, there would have been no abolitionist movement. We would still have slavery. We would still have, we have to say this. Wilberforce and his group, the Clapham Circle, by bringing their Christian values into the public square, did every kind of good that anybody today would say, of course, it's a wonderful thing. They helped the poor. They helped the poor in innumerable ways. They were very involved in prison reform. The prisons were like dungeons. People are dying in them. They were involved in prison reform. You just mentioned Charles Middleton, the admiral, caring about convicts being transported to Australia. He cared about them. That came from his Christian beliefs. But caring about the prisoner, caring about the poor, this was not popular until Wilberforce was able to get his ideas into the public square. It was the normal thing to say that, well, if somebody's poor, they deserve to be poor. Now, that's not a Christian view. But again, people would go to church, but they didn't have a Christian view. It was a deeply pagan culture. So you have people dying like flies, incredible alcoholism, just horrors upon horrors. And Wilberforce says, I as a Christian have a responsibility to these people. And then you had people like Lord Melbourne saying, no, everything's fine, leave it alone. And by God's grace, Wilberforce's view prevailed.
So you had a Prime Minister whose legacy is what? Well, he's regarded as having been a good, solid counsellor for the young Queen Victoria,
Yeah.
but apart from that, it was pretty bland.
Yeah.
You have Wilberforce, whose legacy is massive,
Yeah.
perhaps the greatest social reformer that I can think of
Os
down through
Guinness,
history.
Os Guinness said that he thought that Wilberforce was the greatest social reformer in the history of the world, and I repeat that in my book because it's true. There's no way around it. What he did, when you bring the Christian faith into the public square where it hasn't been, you change everything. You touch everything. There was horrific public animal cruelty, bull baiting and bear baiting. They had public executions where the drunken mobs would show up to watch someone hanged. They would have public dissections of human beings that had just been hanged. Every kind of horror that today we would say is degrading, it's bad on every level. Wilberforce and his fellow Christians said that it's time in England that we clean house. There's been corruption, there's been no care for the poor, let's figure it out. And here we are in the West where, ever since Wilberforce, we've all said, well, of course this is correct, but we forget where it came from.
So at the very least, the point to draw out of that is to those modern day secularists, militant secularists who say religion should be a private affair, just stop and think carefully about your history and where we would be as a culture.
It's madness. We have
If
to
that
be
had been
really
insisted
clear.
upon.
We have to be really clear that everything we value in the West, caring for the poor, caring for the outsider, the immigrant, the refugee. Where do these ideas come from? They all come out of the Scripture, and to the extent that we have a social conscience, it was really Wilberforce bringing biblical values into the public square, into the cultural conversation. And now we all know we've got to take care of the poor. We've got to care about how prisoners are treated. We've got to care about all these things. It came from the Bible, and it came from really devout Christians like Wilberforce. There's no way around it. And I think maybe people just say, well, maybe that was true then, but now things are different. But you cannot have your cake and eat it too. Either these ideas and the idea of bringing biblical values into the public square has worth, or it doesn't. You can't say I'm going to pick my values. I mean, the biblical values are very broad, and they've touched so many different things. And to this day, I would say, well, I would at least say what you've been saying is that we have to understand where we got these ideas from.
Yeah. So we've been talking about a number of people with enormous, if you like, moral courage, spoken out in very difficult circumstances. Let's come to another worthy recipient of your affections as a very insightful and powerful writer. You've written a book on Bonhoeffer, who displayed enormous moral and physical courage during the Second World War. That book has sold, incidentally, I understand, vast numbers, over 1 million.
Yeah, the most amazing thing to me is that it's been translated into 20 languages now, and it will surely be translated back into English, so we can read it again. Ha ha. No, but it's been translated into 20 languages, and that thrills me because it's one of those stories I want everyone in the world to be familiar with. The same thing with Wilberforce. I mean, these are extraordinary stories. There's just no way around it. And you want everyone to know these stories. And I'm embarrassed that I didn't know them until I wrote the books, that it was writing these books that made me understand who these men really were.
So there are those who, according to the creed, they're now wanting to declare Bonhoeffer should have kept his religion private?
Oh my gosh, I don't think so, no. Bonhoeffer, I mean, it's an amazing thing. It's the same story over and over and over. Bonhoeffer was what I would call an actual Christian among many nominal Christians, or people who behaved as though they were nominal Christians. They were afraid, and they didn't speak up. So here you have somebody saying, look, as a Christian, the same thing as Wilberforce, as a Christian, I'm obliged to speak up for anyone who is suffering, including non-Christians. So Wilberforce spoke up for the Africans. Bonhoeffer spoke up for the Jews. He said, it is our obligation as Christians to take a stand when we see injustice, whether perpetrated by our government or by anyone. And of course, Wilberforce saw tremendous injustice perpetrated by his government, which allowed slavery and the slave trade. Bonhoeffer saw terrible injustice perpetrated by the Nazi Party, which had taken over the government. He felt compelled to speak against it, and he did speak against it. And it's very interesting. You see the same thing, as I say, over and over. You have people in the church establishment who prove themselves not to be real Christians or serious Christians or devout Christians. Their Christianity ends when things get uncomfortable, where they may lose some cultural capital. They don't want to rock the boat. Bonhoeffer and Wilberforce, the reason they are heroes, at least my heroes, is because they were willing to rock the boat. They said, this is clear, we must speak up. Our faith compels us to speak up. And there were many Germans who call themselves Christians who said, I'm not going to speak up for the Jews. They had a tribal view of Christianity versus an actual view of Christianity, which is, this is the only faith that is not in any sense tribal. It's for everyone. It's for the slave. It's for the free. It's for the male, for the female. Bonhoeffer got that, Wilberforce got that, and they lived it out. And of course, Wilberforce's story is a very happy ending in a way. Bonhoeffer's story is really tragic, but we wouldn't be talking about him and wanting to emulate him if he'd done anything any other way. So it's beautiful to see a life lived the way God intended it to be lived. He's a hero today, when how many people looked the other way or made their compromises, and you will never hear their names.
Both those men, in a sense, had options, did they not? They were both actually from privileged backgrounds. Wilberforce could have walked away from it and back into comfort.
Yeah.
In today's terms, he had a fortune, perhaps $300 or $400 million. Yeah. He died a pauper, gave so much of it away during his life. Yeah. He could have escaped it. He didn't have to do it. Bonhoeffer had the opportunity to not return to Germany, but chose to go back.
Well, that's the thing, is that
time.
Bonhoeffer was he was he tried to do everything he could in the 30s, and the Nazis made it less and less possible for him to do anything until he really could do nothing. Then the war came, and he was obliged to serve in the war, whether as a chaplain or as a soldier. And he knew he could not in good conscience serve in Hitler's war. He knew that this would be a violation of his Christian values. And he thought, well, what do I do now? I don't want to make a public spectacle of myself because I don't want to embarrass all the other serious Christians and get them into trouble. How can I do this in such a way that will be quiet? And some friends finagled for him to be invited to the United States to teach here, just a few miles from where we're sitting. And so he accepted it. Yep. They pulled some serious strings for him to be able to do this, and a friend in Chicago. And so he comes here, and no sooner does he get on the ship headed across the Atlantic than he begins to have second thoughts and begins to feel that, I don't know that God is going to bless what I'm doing. I feel that maybe I need to go back sooner than I thought. And with every day that passes, he thinks that I need to go back even sooner than I thought yesterday, until 26 days after he has landed in America, he gets on a ship to go back. 26 days. He'd planned to spend maybe 3 years. He knew, and everyone knew when he arrived back in Germany, that he is facing certain danger, possible death. He knew it. And yet, he even when he was in England, on his way back, he stopped in England to see his sister, who had escaped with her Jewish husband to London. He visited her and got news that Paul Schneiderman, who was a Jew, had been killed in a concentration camp. And he still goes back. He doesn't stay in England. He knows that he's facing terrible danger, but God compels him. That's real faith. If you want to know what faith is doing what you think God is telling you to do when anything else would be preferable on the surface of it. I mean, I'm sure many people, I know that people tried to talk him out of it, but he was resolute, and he went back and he did what he could. And I think he did many, many great things and encouraged many people, and encourages us today, many years after it happened, after he was killed by the Nazis. How many of us, just people who've read my book, have found strength? That's a life well lived. I think that we all ultimately should prefer that kind of a life to a long, comfortable life that inspires nobody.
Standing back a little further, as a historian, the land of Luther.
Yeah.
How did it go from being a country where there was a real church?
Yeah.
There was at least some real faith.
Yeah.
In many ways, Germany, almost first amongst the European countries, started to cut itself off, I suspect. Higher criticism from the 1830s and so forth, from its Christian roots.
Yeah.
But even by the 1930s, it's one of the most educated races on earth, perhaps the most educated people ever.
Yeah.
There's a bit of a lesson in that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Education it doesn't mean wisdom, doesn't mean compassion, doesn't mean...
Wisdom and intelligence are utterly separate. You can be very, very cultured and a fool. I won't mention names, but I can think of people who are very, very cultured or have great cultural credentials and great cultural capital, but they behave in foolish ways. And they're very, very simple people who don't dress correctly, but they have profound wisdom. The fact that Germany was very educated and it was the land of Bach and Schiller and Goethe, that's all beautiful, but by the 1930s, they had lost their way. In fact, let me say this. How had they lost their way? Specifically, and this is exactly the case with Wilberforce's England, they had become very nominally and culturally Christian. In other words, to be a German was to be a Lutheran, was to be a Christian. They had really lost the fire of faith. The same thing, obviously, in England in Wilberforce's time, that everybody was a Christian. Everybody says, I'm Church of England, Church of England, Church of England. Well, okay, if everybody's Church of England, is anybody Church of England? Is anybody a Christian? The fact is that in Bonhoeffer's day, the church had become merely cultural, and they had lost that, as I said, that fire of faith that comes in many ways with being an outsider, or with being, that sometimes, people talk about Constantine and the Roman Empire, that once the whole empire is declared Christian, then what does it mean to be a Christian? If you're not going to be persecuted for your faith, suddenly there's an opposite danger, that you'll lose your faith. In Bonhoeffer's day, and I would say in many other cultures besides Germany of the 30s or England of Wilberforce's time, you have this tension between people who are really serious about their faith and want to live it out in a self-sacrificial way, and who will become heroes because of that. And then everybody else that's kind of, they're comfortable and they have this, they have a church-going habit. Maybe they say that they're Christians, they have some Christian values, but they've lost what Jesus in Revelation calls your first love, a real passion to do what God wants you to do, to care for those who are suffering. That's it's a terrible thing, and I know that Bonhoeffer tried to wake up the German church. And it's why he reminds me of an Old Testament prophet, in the sense that the Old Testament prophets did the same thing. They had this fire, and they tried to wake up the people of God, the Israelites, to be the people of God. They weren't asking them, to be converted from being pagans to being Israelites. They were asking them, as Israelites, to be the real thing, you're supposed to be God's chosen people, behave like God's chosen people, and leave off these other idols. Bonhoeffer was trying to get the German Christians to stand up as the church, to be the church, to stand against the National Socialists. In my country, the United States, I see similar things where you have real issues, as you do in Australia, on religious liberty, and you can see who the real Christians are, who are willing to take this unpopular stand. People who want to be comfortable in the culture will not speak about those things. You don't speak about those things at cocktail parties. Well, people like Bonhoeffer and Wilberforce speak about those things wherever they go, and so they get fewer invitations maybe, but they are not willing to compromise what they know is right. That's, as far as they're concerned, what it is to be the church. Bonhoeffer, as I said, tried very hard to get the German church to wake up. If the German church had woken up in time, the Holocaust never would have happened. That's a horrible thing to think about, that it was something that might have been averted. I say the same thing to my fellow Christians in the West today, that unless you understand what the faith really is, and unless you live it out devoutly, radically, terrible things are going to happen. It's up to you. It's up to the church. It's up to the people of God. And I think that that is always the question: is which way are things going to break? In Wilberforce's day, he was able to wake up enough men and women in England to say, yes, this is right. Let's stand up. Let's abolish the slave trade. Let's abolish all these other horrible things. Let's do the right thing. And you have what's called, the Victorian era, this tremendous era of reforms and, do-gooders. How can we help the poor? How can we do this, do that? It really changed the face of the West. And in Bonhoeffer's day, just the opposite. He failed, and by fail, it's not that he failed. I mean, the church failed to heed God's voice through Bonhoeffer. And as a result of that, to this day, 80 years later, Germans effectively hang their heads in shame over this blot, which can never be expunged. It's really extraordinary that we're 80 years after this, and Germany as a nation still feels the weight of guilt for not having done the right thing. And ultimately, I think we always have to point our fingers at the church. The church is supposed to lead. If you call yourself a Christian, you are the one that's supposed to speak up and lead the way. And when the church does not lead the way, when people are too comfortable or they're just not willing, really terrible things can happen. So you have, the great version, Wilberforce, everything really broke in the right way and leads to tremendous reforms, not just in England, but throughout the West. And then you have the story of Bonhoeffer, which the church didn't wake up in time. They woke up, just after it was too late. Their religious liberties were being crushed down. And by the time they saw it, by the time they reacted, it was too late. They had no political power. So there's a lesson there for Australians and Americans and everybody in the West. It's a very serious lesson.
There's a lesson. I agree entirely with that. But there's a question too. Why are we so determined, it seems now, to ensure that these great slabs of our history that are so critical to us understanding who we are and where we might go and where we might not go, why is it not taught properly?
Well, it's not taught because I would say that the secular left has, in the last 50 or so years, taken control of the main institutions. I mean, the academy, universities, and the media are far more liberal and agnostic or secular than the rest of the West, than the people who populate what we call the West.
So to be liberal and secular and cynical gives you the right to airbrush history or revise it or not teach it at all?
It's 100% wrong. It's evil. It's doing great damage. But I'm saying if you want to understand how it's happened, we've, to some extent, Christians who have been silent or Christians who have opted out of these positions of cultural power have contributed to it. In other words, when you paint yourself into a corner that says that I'm just going to hang out with people with whom I agree, you're participating in your own marginalization. In other words, if the church says that, we're just going to be serious about our faith when we go into that building on Sunday mornings, you're participating in your own marginalization so that people can say, well, the real world has nothing to do with that. So the real world effectively becomes what Richard John Neuhaus famously called the naked public square. It becomes secular. The founders in the United States and the champions of freedom around the world have always said no, just the opposite of what Lord Melbourne said. They say we cannot privatize our faith. The exercise of a robust biblical faith is the keystone, is the cornerstone of all of these things that we value. And so when you begin to participate in your own privatization or marginalization, as I said, it's a spiral, so to speak. And so everything we've been talking about, these are simply true. But I don't have the national platform that many people who disagree with me have. That's where we are now. But because of things like this and because of the internet, we don't know how many people will watch this. You have to do all you can to get this out. It's why I write books, and it's why I do what I do. I have a radio program, but it's a drop in the bucket. I mean, we really have an uphill march. But if God is with us, who can be against us? I mean, if the Holy Spirit is at our backs, it doesn't matter how steep the climb is. But I think that, if you care about those who are suffering, if you care about those in the world who don't have freedom, you have to take a stand. And sometimes it will be unpopular. Right now, I think there are things happening that are shifting the cultural narrative. So I really do have hope, genuinely.
So we've arrived at the point where we're talking about today's culture wars.
Yeah.
I'd have to say, part of the reason I'm trying to do this series and put down these conversations is that I don't think it's going very well in the West, frankly. We all look to be tearing ourselves apart within our own nations and almost between nations in terms of misunderstanding, in terms of the loss of all of the old rules about debating respectfully, relying on the evidence. Wilberforce himself said, in the battle between opinions and facts, I normally go for the facts. That's my advice, he said to a younger man, and he was counselling one day. We don't seem to go for the fact, we run on emotion all the time. Tell us about Trump's America as you see it now.
Trump's America. Well, it's a funny thing because Trump, he's a classic example of, classic example. He's a dramatic example of this disconnect. In other words, there has existed, for a long time, but let's say, again, the last 50 years roughly, this kind of disconnect between the cultural mandarins, the cultural elites, who have really controlled the universities and have controlled media, and they have been largely speaking politically liberal and secular. And if you hang around in those circles, as I have, and I'm sure as you have, you see it. It's just the reality. At a place like Yale University, where I was privileged to go, there's really only one view that's possible. You can't be, a Neanderthal who thinks, who has politically conservative views. That's not accepted. In New York City, in Manhattan, where I live, where we are, those things are not accepted. So you kind of, you buy into that and you begin to see this is the way the cultural elites think. Well, we have a tradition in America where we say that once something becomes tyranny or close to tyranny, we rebel, right? We understand that to be free to govern oneself means that once we feel that we are being governed from without, we have to throw off those shackles. Now, we have a way of doing it. It's called elections. And in the election of Donald Trump, I think it's a very dramatic example of people voting for someone who is the precise opposite of what the cultural elites hold out as dear. And there's many contradictions and ironies, but the bottom line is that I think this is part of what one saw with the Brexit vote, that there are people that are beginning to feel genuinely disenfranchised. They're saying, hang on, something has gone wrong. I've been sold a bill of goods, and I've gone with it for a while, but at some point you say, the people who are supposed to represent me are not representing me. They're out of touch with me. They're pushing forward agendas that I never asked them to push. And so I really think that the election of Trump mostly is a very, very healthy sign. I have to say that it's a healthy sign. Trump is very far from perfect. But the reason that doesn't bother me is because I know that I too am very far from perfect. It's not about being perfect, it's about trying to do one's best. And I think that when you have a choice between someone as tremendously corrupt and cynical as Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, it was not a difficult choice. With all of Trump's flaws, he struck most in America as a kind of breath of fresh air. And I think that that's been reported so little that it probably comes across as a shock to many people who are listening to this program. But I think many people think that also think that Trump is not the man he once was, that some of his sins in the past are not things that he would repeat today. And I honestly think that when you think of Bill Clinton and John F. Kennedy, the sainted John F. Kennedy, what they did in the White House, they did horrible things with women to whom they're not married in the White House as presidents. And today we have a president who 10 years ago did things that clearly I would oppose. But you have to weigh these things. First of all, it's clear, anybody who has any kind of serious faith has to stand against those things. But whether that means somebody is barred from being elected is another question. And I really think that things have gotten so bad with regard to religious liberty in the United States of America that people took a gamble on Trump rather than going with the sure catastrophe of Hillary Clinton. I mean, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were moving the United States in a direction away from the founders' view of liberty, and particularly religious liberty, in a very dramatic way, in a very troubling way. And I think Christians finally woke up and said, this can't go on. This has gotten so bad, we've got to do something. And so we did something very, very terrible. We elected Donald Trump to the presidency of the United States because we thought the alternative was Hillary Clinton. It's actually, in some ways, very funny because of the ironies of the whole thing.
It strikes me that one of the problems we face in the West, C.S. Lewis used to say that the heart, and we shouldn't forget C.S. Lewis, who's a magnificently powerful mind and a very, very
Well, he's
brilliant
prophetic.
writer.
I mean, his book, The Abolition of Man, That Hideous Strength, those books are prophetic. They predict where we are today.
They do.
There's no question.
But we ought never to forget the emphasis he placed on the problem of pride being the one that lies at the heart of all our other failings.
Right.
And leaves in us an inability to look out and see our other people. We're looking down on them, we can't see them.
That's right.
And it seems to me that this terrible standoff we've got with the between the political extremes today calls, if we're to ever resolve it, for a good dose of common, decent humility and a willingness to talk to others.
But I have to say that, candidly, I have to fault the left at this point. I think that true liberalism values diversity and tolerance. And now we have a faux diversity and a faux tolerance. In other words, it's tolerance of everything except those with whom we disagree. It's really ultimately nothing less than rank hypocrisy, that you speak of tolerance and diversity, but you demonize those with whom you disagree. You try to shut them up. In other words, instead of having a robust conversation on religious liberty, on same-sex marriage, the left tried and virtually succeeded in shutting down conversation. Now, why do you shut down conversation? You shut down conversation when you're afraid to have a conversation, when you don't maybe have the facts on your side, when you're afraid that if it's put to a vote, you'll lose. In fact, it was put to a vote in many states, and people voted, for example, against same-sex marriage. And it was overridden by judges. This is a real problem in the United States, that you lose genuine democracy and self-government when judges are able to override
unelected judges.
Unelected judges are able to override the will of the people, and so we face some real problems. But this is something that at this point I do have to say that the cultural fascists have been those on the hard left, never true liberals. True liberals are respectful of differing views and have this idea that we can arrive at the truth through civility. But I have seen, as I say, a tremendous lurch in the direction of what is a kind of fascism. And again, you have irony, tremendous irony, because those who are the most fascist label themselves anti-fascist, the Antifa movement. I mean, they're hooligans. They're hooligans. The brown shirts of Hitler were hooligans. Once you resort to those kinds of street-level, thuggish tactics, as far as I'm concerned, you lose the debate. You've lost the debate, and you've effectively acknowledged that you've lost the debate because you're resorting to these kinds of tactics, to shutting down those with whom you disagree, to shouting them down, to trying to get them off the air. I mean, a number of conservative pundits in the United States have faced tremendous battles, people trying to target their advertisers because they're saying things that people don't like. But having watched many of those programs, I have to say they're not saying anything genuinely objectionable. So why are people so afraid of this kind of conversation? I really think that your average person anywhere in the West sees these things, and so I think that because we still have some freedom, I have a lot of hope. I mean, I really do. I don't just say that. I mean, I feel like we're commanded to hope as a Christian. As a Christian, I'm commanded to hope, but I also see great signs of hope. So I'm not. It's not to say that I'm not concerned, but I'm hopeful.
So let's try and land this. We've talked a lot tonight about two great heroes in our past, Wilberforce and Bonhoeffer. Both displayed enormous courage. Both sought to plead with, to persuade, to model. Both made enormous sacrifices, really. One of them the ultimate sacrifice, for their fellow human beings.
Yeah.
What should Christians today who really care for their fellow human beings be prioritising, and how should they go about it?
Well, that's a big question. Earlier I said, I was speaking somewhat ironically when I said that, people like Wilberforce or some of these Christians were imposing their faith on India. I'm saying it, as I say, ironically, because what a joke. I mean, you're imposing nothing. You're giving freedom and the ideas of freedom and the ideas of the nobility of women and the sanctity of all life, women and children and lower castes. And these are beautiful things. And so, of course, you don't really impose them. At least, let's put it this way. To some extent in the past, one might have imposed them. My understanding, however, for where we are today is, to quote my hero, my friend, the late Chuck Colson. He would say, we propose. We don't impose, we propose. The difficulty is when you propose things to people who are violently opposed to what you're proposing, it's their inclination, again, to say, shut up, go away, and try to... I mean, when I was in Australia 2 years ago, I was going to give a talk, and the protesters were just horrid. I mean, I'd never seen anything like it. I've never been protested in my life, and I thought to myself, they're not winsome. They're not... when we think of heroes like Martin Luther King Jr., he was proposing Christian values to a culture where some people could see it and get it, and some people didn't like it. Now, how do you respond to somebody when they're speaking like that? I mean, initially, they were using fire hoses and dogs on them. When people are using fire hoses and dogs, or when people are protesting in rough ways, you suspect that they're afraid of the truth, that they're afraid of what you're proposing. And so the first thing I would say to all people, is that you have to be brave enough to countenance ideas that maybe at first you don't understand or approve of, but hear people out, hear the other side out. When I spoke at the University of the South, Sewanee, here in the United States, they gave me an honorary degree, and I was allowed to be their convocation speaker. And I said to the students, be open to both sides of the argument. Have friends on both sides of the argument. For example, back then I said of same-sex marriage. If you don't know anyone who's for same-sex marriage, you should have some friends so you can hear their point of view on that. If you don't have any friends who are opposed to same-sex marriage, you should think about having some friends who are opposed to it. Maybe they have a principled opposition. Hear them out. Merely by saying that, there was a month later just an incredibly vitriolic article written in the student newspaper, and it was actually hilarious. If you look at the text of my speech and then what the person was saying, the person was just fulminating with anger that I would even dare to hint in the direction that something like same-sex marriage might not be a great idea. Not even open to the idea that maybe I have a good reason. Maybe I have a principled reason. No, the instinct was to demonize the person, to shut them up, to make them persona non grata in civilized society. And when you're doing that, you really are keeping, you're keeping at arm's length things that may bless you. There are many, many people that are opposed to things like same-sex marriage. And when you actually talk to them, you find out, well, gosh, they're not bigots. They have their views much more complicated than I thought, and they're actually good people, and they have a point. But if you never allow them to speak, you'll never be able to see them as human beings. And so, ironically now, all the people who are wrapping themselves in the mantle of victimhood are, in fact, really championing a view of things that says, I don't want to be the victim, I want to be the oppressor. It's not that we want to get rid of all victims. I want to be the oppressor, and I want to wrap myself in the mantle of victimhood so that I can use it as a bludgeon to oppress the people that I think were oppressing me. In a sense, you're going backwards. And so I think that The first thing you can do if you're a person of faith is to speak the truth. Try to speak the truth even when people say, shut up, we don't want to hear what you're saying, you're a bigot. You say, excuse me, I'm not a bigot. And I know I'm not a bigot. I answer to God. And if I were a bigot, I would care about that. And so just calling me that to shut me up is not furthering the conversation. Let's have a conversation and try to put these ideas out there. And I think that, you know, many times when you try to shut people up, you'll get a different kind of backlash. I mean, that in the United States, when Roe v. Wade legalized abortion across the land, there were many, many states where the people had stood against it. And the same thing with same-sex marriage. But the Supreme Court said, no, 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 shut up. The Constitution says you're wrong. It doesn't matter how you think. It doesn't matter what you voted. We're going to impose this now, right? And by doing that, I think it made many, many people feel disenfranchised. They said, well, wait a second. The Supreme Court, 9 people have decided on issues that go to the very core of my identity. In a weird way, what they've done is they have imposed a secular religion. It's still a religion. It's still the imposition of a way of thinking about ultimate things. And in a free country where you have genuine religious liberty, you can't do that. You mustn't do that. You have to allow the people to work these things out. Abortion has been a hot topic forever in the United States. And I think that I see that the other side really does not want the facts to get out. And as science makes it more and more obvious what's in a woman's tummy, it's little kids know that that's my brother in there. That's, you know, you see the little picture on the refrigerator of the sonogram. It's like, that's my brother, that's my sister. The more time passes, the more these facts will get out. And when facts get out, it can be a dangerous thing for people who say it's all settled. So I think on the issue of the unborn, who are, you know, the most oppressed, the most disenfranchised anywhere, especially in the West, the facts are getting out. We're finding out more and more, for example, that women are far from being empowered by having abortions. They're being bullied by men who refuse to take responsibility for what they have done and are saying, you've got to take care of this. And if you don't take care of this, I'm going to walk away from you. If you don't take care of it. I mean, you don't hear those stories, but those stories are getting out more and more and more, that it is men bullying women. It's not empowering women. And then you find that many women that have had abortions feel destroyed by it. Those stories are leaking out. And I think when the stories get out and the facts get out, it spells trouble for the pro-abortion cause, which is why they have spent a lot of money keeping their versions of things out there and suppressing any of this other information. Wilberforce's great effort was to educate the people of England on the slave trade. He said, if they know the facts, if they know the facts of what this is, they don't know it, they don't see it because it's not happening in front of them, let's get them the information, let's get them the data. When they see it, most English men and women will know what is right and what is wrong in this case. And so he said, we've got to be patient and we've got to get the facts out. I say the same thing about sexuality, the same thing about transgender, all of these things. If we get the facts out, if we're honest, if we care about human beings rather than political slogans or cultural cliches, if we do those things in faith that the truth wins in the end, really we're doing the only thing that we can do, and we're doing the only thing that we need to do. In time, to quote Shakespeare, the truth will out. We've got to work on getting the facts out, and we've got to work on forcing people to have civil debate and tolerance of views that they may think of as bigoted, but it's to shut down conversation like that. It will not do in a free society, and we really have to fight for a place at the table, knowing that if all things being equal, you know, the truth wins, and that's our hope. And I would say it's a good hope.
Well, Eric, thank you very much. You've shared with us that enormous sense of vitality that you have, and your passion, and your conviction. And I think my final remark would be to say that evidence demands a verdict. It's no use just shouting down the things that you've had to say for those who might disagree. They actually need to point out where you've been wrong. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.